Scholars in the Middle Ages were committed to the use of logical argument in the pursuit of truth. Today, we're going to explore how they used logical argument in pursuit of the ultimate question, whether God exists. How did they use reason to demonstrate that? Join me today for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Last time we looked at the development of the university system and the indispensable role that the Catholic Church played. We saw how the popes played a critical role in protecting the students and fostering university life and even making possible an international scholarly community. Now these days, unfortunately, the Church is rarely if ever given credit for these things, but I assure you, everything I'm telling you is based on sources that are easily consulted. Pick up a history of the university and you'll read this for yourself. Today, I want to pursue this avenue of inquiry even further. I want to introduce some important personalities and look at things they did and said and the questions they pursued. And in particular, I want to take two famous people in church history and look at how they answered the critical question, can we prove the existence of God? And if so, how? Now that's very unfashionable today, because today, as I said at the beginning, we're being bombarded by arguments by, frankly, militant atheists who claim that it's irrational to believe in God, that of course a critical, scientific-minded thinker could never believe in God. Well, I hope to convince you otherwise today. Well, first, let's begin with a few personalities. It is worth noting that in the Middle Ages, there was a commitment to logical argument and a belief that logic and reason could lead you to the truth. In fact, Pope John the 21st wrote a book on logic, and his textbook was used for centuries afterward and went through 166 printings. Very, very few books go through that many printings. And here is a pope, a future pope, writing a book of that nature. Now, more specifically, a fellow named Peter Abelard was a scholar who died around 1142. He was controversial in his day, but he paved the way for scholars who came after him. Abelard was known particularly for a book he wrote, in Latin is known as Sic et Non. Literally means yes and no. Because what Abelard did was he took apparent contradictions, for example, apparently contradictory biblical verses, or apparently contradictory statements from church fathers, and he deliberately juxtaposed them so that they were right next to each other on the page. And there you were, face to face with an apparent contradiction. How would that contradiction be resolved? Well, the reason that Abelard's book was a bit scandalous for his time was that he didn't answer that question. He left the apparent contradictions just hanging there. And the reason he did this is he said, I'm a teacher for a living, and I'm not going to do my students' work for them. His students had the task of reconciling these apparent contradictions. So I always get a kick out of it when young students in college would come up to me and say, well, aren't there a lot of contradictions in the Bible? Ho, ho, ho. Well, Peter Abelard was talking about this in the 12th century and was using reason to try to resolve them, so I don't think I need some kid from Long Island to tell me this. But Peter Abelard's point was that when you have two sources, both of which are authoritative, biblical verses, for example, church fathers, but they seem to be saying different things, how can you resolve this matter? You can't resolve it by an appeal to authority, because here you have two authorities that are saying different things. So how do we resolve it? Through the use of reason. Because Peter Abelard was convinced that truth could not contradict itself, that these contradictions must be only apparent contradictions, and that once we get beneath the surface, we'll find that in fact the statements can be perfectly well reconciled. For instance, perhaps the two speakers or the two verses are speaking about the same issue under different aspects. Or perhaps one of the quotations is taken out of context. Whatever the explanation, Peter Abelard was certain that there was one. So here was a scholar who was absolutely prepared to take apparent intellectual difficulties in the faith and arbitrate them at the bar of human reason. Now that is pretty much exactly the opposite impression that I think people have about the Catholic Church, is it not? Then we have a fellow named Peter Lombard. He lived from about 1100 to 1160, who wrote a work of theology called the Sentences that became the most studied theological text, apart from the Bible, for the next several centuries. Now, Lombard, in his book, used authority to explain various aspects of the faith, but he did not hesitate also to appeal to human reason in order better to understand and explore the mysteries of our faith. Again, more or less the opposite of what we're told, isn't it? This, in a nutshell, is what we call scholasticism. In some ways, it's hard to define scholasticism in a way that every single scholastic would qualify as one. But I think it's safe to say that scholasticism initially began as a term simply to refer to professors who taught in universities. Now, right away, that would exclude St. Anselm, because he didn't teach in a university, but he was a scholastic, so it doesn't always work. But beyond that, the scholastics typically were interested in the use of reason in order to understand better and to defend the Catholic faith. They believed that there was no contradiction between reason and faith, and that if there appeared to be one, then we had simply misused our reason, we had not correctly argued the matter, or we simply understood some aspect of the faith. But the two could not contradict each other. They were two wings, in effect, that would soar toward the truth. I believe that's how Pope John Paul II put it in his encyclical Fides et Ratio in the late 1990s. That's exactly what St. Thomas Aquinas believed. So the scholastics are committed to this project of the use of reason in the pursuit of truth and in entertaining opposing views. Typically, particularly after the 13th century, a scholastic didn't just get up there, give his position, and sit down. He always anticipated what the other side would say. And as I said, St. Thomas Aquinas was so generous to his opponents that he would not only explain their position very persuasively, but he would sometimes think of arguments that his own opponents hadn't even thought of, and he would come up with those arguments and say, here, you can have these arguments, but I'm going to answer those too. That's typical of scholasticism. Well, let's look at a well-known early scholastic, a figure we've looked at briefly already, St. Anselm. He's a very early scholastic. He dies around 1109. St. Anselm was interested in this question: does God exist, and can we prove that God exists? Now, it's true, over the course of his career, St. Anselm asked and answered a great many questions. But this one, perhaps more than any other, established him as a philosopher, because even if people didn't accept his argument, from then on, people at least had to reckon with it one way or the other. You had to at least show why you didn't agree with him. St. Anselm, in effect, argued as follows. It's just a very few steps that he took to try to prove through reason alone that God exists. And his first claim is as follows, that regardless of whether you agree with me that God exists, we can certainly agree on a definition of God. God is the greatest conceivable being. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. That was how he put it. So there's our first statement. God's the greatest conceivable being. Our second statement is the greatest conceivable being has to be absolutely perfect, has to be perfect in every way, has to possess every possible perfection. I don't think that's particularly controversial. That follows from the first statement. Now, the third statement goes like this. It's more perfect if you exist both in reality and in the mind than if you exist only in the mind. Now, that might sound a little tricky, so I'll give you a good example. Suppose you're thinking in your mind about a hot fudge sundae, but it doesn't exist in reality. There is no hot fudge sundae in the room. It's only in your mind. I think we would all agree that that hot fudge sundae is not as perfect that hot fudge sundae is not as perfect as a hot fudge sundae that is both in your mind and right on the table in front of you. it has a perfection by existing in the world that the imaginary Sunday does not have. Well, what does this have to do with God? Well, what St. Anselm is saying is, suppose God exists only in our minds. He's just a figment of our imagination, like the non-existent hot fudge sundae. Well, then that being is not as perfect as a being who existed both in our minds and also in reality. Now, his next step, in effect, is, therefore God exists. Now, it might seem like he's maybe skipping a few steps here. How does he get there? Well, his point is, if we've said that God's the greatest conceivable being, he has every possible perfection, and one perfection is to exist in reality, the greatest conceivable being would have to have that perfection. He would have to exist in reality, or he wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being if he were only in your mind. But we already agreed that he is. Therefore, God exists. Now, in effect, what St. Anselm is saying is that the existence of God is implied in the very definition of God. Once we unpack that definition, what do we find? We find that his existence is immediately implied. In the same way that if we really understand what the number 9 is, then what follows from the definition of 9 is that its square root has to be 3. Once we've fully understood the concept of 9, we understand its square root is 3. Well, likewise, once we fully understand the definition of God, we then see that part of his nature is to exist. He has to exist. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm not so sure that one works, that seems a little bit slippery, I will point out that most philosophers have in fact rejected St. Anselm's proof. In fact, St. Thomas Aquinas rejected St. Anselm's proof, as a matter of fact. But there's always been, in the Western philosophical tradition, a minority tradition that has accepted Anselm's proof. And, in fact, very recently, a dear friend of mine, Bill Mara, who died in 1998, he taught philosophy at Fordham for decades. And he absolutely believed that Anselm's proof works. But whether you believe it or not, for our purposes, is not so important. What I simply want to show you is that Anselm and other Catholics were committed to the pursuit of truth through human reason. There is nothing scriptural in that argument from St. Anselm. He wanted to show that the human mind could solve this problem. Well, after the break, we're going to see how St. Thomas Aquinas solved this problem, and I think much more persuasively. So join me after the break. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Before the break, we just finished looking at St. Anselm's proof for the existence of God. And if you want to impress your friends, you can refer to it as the ontological proof for the existence of God, and you can sound like a highfalutin philosopher. Not that you would want to, but you can do that. Now, as I said, St. Anselm's proof was rejected by a great many philosophers. Now I'd like to consider one that was offered by St. Thomas Aquinas. But let's first begin with a little bit of background on St. Thomas and his views. Now, St. Thomas lived in the 13th century from about 1225 to 1274. So when you consider how young a man he was when he died, his corpus of work becomes all the more impressive. How could you possibly have done this? How could you have possibly done it? It calls to mind the statement by St. Isidore of Seville, who once said that anyone who tells you that he's read everything Augustine has written must be a liar. Well, in a way, you almost feel that way about St. Thomas, anyone who's read it all and really, truly absorbed everything. Well, St. Thomas was convinced, as were the typical run of scholastics in his day, that faith and reason could not contradict each other. And St. Thomas believed that our knowledge consisted of 3 different kinds. For instance, he argued that some of our knowledge we know through divine revelation alone. Some knowledge we know both through divine revelation and through human reason, and still other kinds of knowledge are known through reason alone. So, for example, one piece of information that we have that we know through divine revelation alone would be that God is a Trinity, that He's one God in three divine persons. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas said that this is something we have to know through divine revelation because human reason could never arrive at this conclusion. This is an astonishing mystery. We could never arrive at this conclusion. Now, if I may digress for a moment, I'll point out that some thinkers have tried to claim that human reason can also prove the Trinity. The argument is that if we know that God is love, and we're going to make that something other than just a bumper sticker slogan, God is love, we're really going to take it seriously, then God has to have a threefold nature. Because if He is love, that means we have to have within God the two who love, because love exists between two parties, and then love is fruitful. So there has to be a third party, in effect. There has to be the fruits of that love. That's why some theologians have sometimes pointed to the family, the human family of husband, wife, and child, as in fact imaging the Trinity, as a mirror into the divine economy. Economy, of course, in its Greek root, meaning household. Because, in effect, the husband and wife love each other, and the fruit of that love is their child. Well, that's neither here nor there, because the consensus is that the Trinity is not something that we can arrive at through strict proof. So that would fall under St. Thomas's first category. The second category, things we can know through divine revelation and through reason, would include, for example, some aspects of the moral law. I suppose reflecting on the subject of murder, just simply reflecting on it honestly, using your mind, you can probably arrive at the conclusion that murder is something people ought not to do. That even if God had never said anything about murder, you could probably draw that as a safe conclusion. Now, God has, of course, told us that we may not commit murder. And St. Thomas answered the question that you might ask, why would God tell us something that we could just figure out on our own using human reason? And one of St. Thomas's, I think, pretty good arguments in response to that is, the reason he does it is to make our lives a little easier. Because not everybody is a philosopher or has time to sit around 24 hours a day trying to deduce everything in the world through human reason. So God helps us. He tells us things that, yes, we could figure out on our own, but, well, some of us are too busy or blockheaded to do so, basically. The third area of knowledge is knowledge that is known through reason alone. And an example of that would be what causes rainbows. There's nothing in sacred scripture that explains to us what causes rainbows, and there's nothing in sacred tradition that explains it either. That we understand through the rigorous pursuit of reason. Well, now, getting back to St. Thomas, he poses the question whether God exists. Now, as I said, St. Thomas always anticipates his opponent's arguments, and he anticipates all of them. He even comes up with arguments they haven't thought of. So it's very revealing that when St. Thomas is trying to think of all the arguments against the existence of God, how many does he come up with? Only two. One of them is the existence of evil, and the other one is that the universe seems to run itself. It's like we don't need a God. It would be superfluous to posit the existence of a God. And in some ways, these are very much the same arguments that are still with us today. Well, here's one of St. Thomas's proofs, and I'm sort of adapting it for modern use. But let's begin as follows. Let's suppose you're in the deli, in the supermarket. You want to go up to the deli counter and get some turkey. You go up there, though, and you find that you have to take a number before you can get to the counter and get your turkey. So just as you're about to take your number, you see another device. And this other device says, well, before you can take a number, you have to take a number to get in line to take a number. Well, this is a very disturbing, Kafka-esque deli, to be sure. So you're about to take that number, and it turns out there's another number machine. It says, whoa, 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 not so fast. Before you take that number, you have to take a number. Before you take that number, you have to take a number. So you have to take a number to get in line to take a number, to get in line to take a number, to get to the deli counter. Well, suppose you turn your head and you see that going on infinitely down this supermarket is an infinite series of numbers you have to take. Well, are you ever going to get to the deli counter? Of course not. You'll spend the rest of your miserable, rotten life standing there trying to take numbers, but being unable to do so because there's always a preceding one you have to take. You can never even take a number because there's always one before it that you are supposed to take first. You'll never get to the deli counter, that's for sure. But suppose you're wandering around all frustrated in the supermarket, you're wandering around, and you see somebody with turkey in the shopping cart. Then you know the numbers must not go on forever, because then how did this person get the turkey? There must have been a stopping point somewhere. Or consider this. You want to sign up for a course at a college, a special course, and you're told, well, if you want to sign up for that course, you have to go see Mr. Jones. You go see Mr. Jones, and he says, oh, sorry, before you can see me, you've got to see Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown says, before you can see me, you've got to see Mr. Johnson. You say to yourself, what in the world? Obviously, I don't need to take this course. It's going to drive me insane. You'll obviously never get in there because there's always somebody earlier you have to get permission from before you can do it. But suppose you see somebody enrolled in that course. Then you know there must not be an infinite sequence of people you need to get permission from, because then how did this person get in there? Now, what does this have to do with the existence of God? We have a basic insight as human beings that every effect has a cause. Nothing just exists on its own. Nobody goes down to the beach and says, oh, this sandcastle must have just been randomly created by the movement of the waves, or it existed from all time, or my watch here. Nobody would look at this watch and say, oh, I bet this has just always been there before the beginning of time. No one would say that. Okay, we know that would be nonsense. Or, and I apologize to whoever it is I'm borrowing this from. I can't remember what your name is, but I like this example. Suppose I walk into my office and there's a bowling ball on my chair. Now, there are many possible ways it could have gotten there, but the one explanation I will not accept is, well, it just appeared. It had no cause. No one would accept that, right? I would be willing to consider the most ridiculous explanations before I would accept that. In fact, I'd be willing to consider the possibility that the CIA is trying to spy on me, and they've put a little chip in this bowling ball to make that possible. I would consider that before I would consider the ball just appeared. Well, now here's St. Thomas's proof. Every effect requires a cause. So consider anything existing. It requires a cause. Consider a thing Z. It requires a cause. We'll call the cause of Z Y. But the problem is, Y requires a cause too, right? Y doesn't just exist out of nowhere. Y also has to be caused. Well, what caused Y? Well, we'll say X caused Y. But then we're back to the same problem. What caused X? X isn't just self-existing. Every effect requires a cause. So what caused X? Let's see. W. Okay, I guess you can probably see where I'm going with this. W caused X. And then we keep on going because that doesn't solve the problem either. Because then what caused W? So what St. Thomas is saying is, suppose you have an infinite series of causes in which Z is caused by Y, but Y is caused by X. X is caused by W. W is caused by V, and this just goes on and on forever. If that were true, then nothing would exist. Nothing would exist because before anything could exist, it would be awaiting a cause for its existence. But that cause doesn't yet exist because it requires a cause. And that cause doesn't yet exist because it's awaiting a cause. If everything is always awaiting a previously existing cause, the sequence of causes could never get started. It would be like waiting to try to get turkey at that hideous deli. It just goes on forever. You can never get it started. You can never get that number to get started. It just goes on forever. You'd never get any turkey. And in this case, nothing would exist in the world. But look around you. Things do exist. Okay? Things do exist. The TV you're watching this on exists. All these things do exist. So the series of causes cannot logically go on forever. There must be a stopping point. There must be something that exists entirely outside the causal sequence that gets this relationship going, that begins to cause the next thing, which causes the next thing, which brings all the things we see into existence. And St. Thomas says, this cause must be God. Now, some people will say, well, then what caused God? Well, that actually shows a complete misunderstanding of the argument. The point is simply that it is logically necessary, it's unavoidably necessary, that something must exist outside this causal sequence in order to get it going. Now, I don't think that's a dumb guy argument, right? I find that an overwhelmingly persuasive argument. And I used to explain it to my students when I taught history in New York and I taught Western Civ. I used to do this. It's a legitimate historical point. And it makes you think. Now, you don't reason yourself, typically, into believing in God. But there are a lot of people today, I think, who think that believing in God is just stupid and irrational. Proofs like this can help to break down those barriers for people like that. This is what the universities made possible, this type of rigorous intellectual environment. Pope Innocent IV, a 13th century pope, described the universities as rivers of science which water and make fertile the soil of the universal church. Pope Alexander IV called them lanterns shining in the house of God. But it's not all scholars who built Western civilization. It was people who prayed and did scholarly work, but also did physical labor. And I'm talking now about the monks, who will be the subject of our next program. The monks are probably the most versatile people who ever lived. They prayed, they were agriculturists, they were metallurgists, they were scientists, they were physicians, they provided charity, they provided inns for people. They did more than any other group of people in any culture I've ever been familiar with, and they played an essential role in building Western civilization. So join me next time as we talk about the monks on the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. See you then. Perhaps nowhere on earth has there ever been a group of people more versatile than the monks of Europe. They were physicians and scholars and agriculturists and inventors. And they, perhaps more than any other group, is responsible for helping to save Western civilization. Let's talk about that today on the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. Welcome once again to the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Today it's the monks who helped to save Western civilization. Now there's a small publishing industry out there of books called How So-and-so Saved Civilization. This group saved it, and that group saved it. The monks deserve this title, ladies and gentlemen, the monks. Even the Irish, who are sometimes credited with saving civilization, did so in large part because of their monks. Who were these people, after all? They were monks. Well, I don't want to assume any prior knowledge. Who are the monks? What are they doing? And how did they save Western civilization? We already see in the 3rd century a tradition whereby women religious, we would call them, began to live together and share the same spiritual and prayer life and dedicated themselves to the care of the poor and the sick. So it's very easy to see in that the tradition of convents and the life of the nun. Also in the 3rd century we see a tradition among men to be hermits. The hermits were people who forsook everything, who pursued absolute solitude in order better to commune with God and to hear Him and to pray to Him. St. Anthony of the Desert in the mid-3rd century was a classic example of this. He lived to be over 100 years old, and he went out into the deserts of Egypt. The hermits typically lived completely alone. They would gather on Sundays to worship God, but otherwise they kept to themselves. And they tended small vegetable gardens to support themselves, or they made baskets, but otherwise theirs was a life of extreme solitude. Now, in a certain sense, this is all well and good, and the Church has never altogether repudiated the tradition of hermit life. In fact, she's had a pope who was a hermit in the 1290s, Pope Celestine V. But right away, there were critics of the hermit's life, because the hermit, who lived apart from anyone who could provide him spiritual guidance, sometimes engaged in spiritual practices that were, well, rather questionable. Some of them engaged in, shall we say, penances that were exaggerated, or some of them would go out of their way to wait until food rotted before they would eat it. And this type of thing would go on, and a good many Catholics began to argue that this is not a healthy thing. This is not what God intends. This is not what Christ is calling you to. For example, in the Christian East, St. Basil the Great repeatedly said that the life of the hermit is not the Christian one, ideally, because what we should be doing is living among our fellow human beings, ideally. That would be the best solution. The monks should live in solitude, but in a sense a kind of communal solitude, with other monks, with other people who have in effect retreated from the world. Now it's important to understand the monks are not saying that the world is evil, therefore we retreat from it, or that spaghetti and meatballs and an ice cream sundae are all evil, so therefore I want to deprive myself of them and eat more simply. To the contrary, because Catholics believe in the goodness of the created world, what the monks are saying is that the world is wonderful, it's a great thing, it's filled with a great many delights, and that's why it's such a sacrifice for us to give them up to show how much we love God. One of my friends has sometimes explained it this way: it's one thing to bring flowers for your wife. It's quite another to bring her flowers on a rainy, miserable day when she knows it was just an unbelievable ordeal for you to get those flowers and get back in the car and keep the vase from spilling over in the car. I've had plenty of experience with this, folks. This is exactly why the monks made sacrifices, to show how much they loved God. In the West, it was a man named Saint Benedict who argued that we need to have monks who live in a single place, and they live together, and they have the same spiritual regimen, and they live under the authority of an abbot. St. Benedict composed something called the Rule of St. Benedict, which was in effect an outline for how a monastery should be run. He wrote this around 529, and with the passage of time, this became the model for organizing monasteries. A monastery, of course, is where the monks live. And St. Benedict argued that the monks should live penitential lives, it's true, but not lives that are so penitential that it would disrupt their spiritual lives. We don't want that. We want them to live at the material level of about the average Italian peasant. That would be acceptable. They should get adequate sleep. They shouldn't do too much physical labor. They should be moderate in all things. Physical labor and prayer and study, and nothing out of moderation. The monasteries in Ireland were quite another story. There, the model, in effect, was working 14 hours a day, doing back-breaking labor, and then coming in and praying all the psalms. And this, it seemed to St. Benedict, was just too much, that you couldn't live a healthy spiritual life if you were being that rigorous with your physical body. Now, it should be mentioned, by the way, that the Irish monasteries attracted people from all over. They couldn't house them all, so they must have been doing something right. But this was St. Benedict's model. It was flexible, and it seemed to understand human nature very well. And it turns out that St. Benedict and his monks played an essential role in saving Western civilization at a critical moment and building up important parts of it. And yet, I will never forget, in my days as a professor in New York, after telling my class all about the monks and all the things they had done, I actually had a student say to me, "That's very interesting. Are there any monks today?" Well, that's just depressing, right? That she didn't even know there were still monks today. And so of course I told her, not only are there monks, I've got 1,000,000 friends who are monks. I realize that's perhaps somewhat unusual, but I have a great many friends who are monks. And let me tell you something, living in Manhattan as I did while I was getting my doctorate, you find that just about anything can go on in Manhattan. Nobody cares. Nobody's looking at you. You can have a weird haircut. Nobody cares. You could be on fire. Nobody cares. But I had a friend of mine who was on his way to becoming a monk. He hadn't taken his vows yet, and he came and visited me in his habit. And we went out for nachos at a local place. And I'll tell you, people will look away at anything, but if you're having nachos with a monk, they cannot take their eyes off it, apparently. This is just a bizarre sight, even for Manhattan. So, unfortunately, the monks don't have the high profile they once did, but they deserve our respect. Because, after all, what did the monks accomplish? Well, for one thing, apart from just copying texts, which we all know they did that laboriously, but they also did a lot of physical labor. For example, they cleared and reclaimed all kinds of land in Western Europe. Because what often happened is that people wanted to donate land to the monks as a good work. That's wonderful. Look at what I'm doing for the monks. But people would typically give the monks really crummy land. They want to help them, but they don't want to help them that much. So the monks often found themselves having to deal with land nobody really wanted. And a lot of times it was swampland. In those days, I mean, obviously a swamp has no value. It's just a source of pestilence. The monks would dike and drain the swamp and make it into fertile land. And a great many experts on the history of agriculture in Western Europe have said, for example, we owe the agricultural restoration of a great part of Europe to the monks. Another one said, wherever they came, they converted the wilderness into a cultivated country. They pursued the breeding of cattle and agriculture, labored with their own hands, drained morasses and cleared away forests. By them, Germany was rendered a fruitful country. And finally, every Benedictine monastery was an agricultural college for the whole region in which it was located. The monks introduced crops and industries and production methods that people hadn't known before. And they weren't afraid to work with their hands at a time when manual labor was looked down upon and despised. The monks were inspired to engage in physical labor because they knew, for one thing, that when you engage in hard physical labor, this can be a great form of penance and an opportunity for the mortification of the flesh. So sure, they were thrilled to work with the swamp that nobody else wanted to do. So at a time when you were despised for doing physical labor, the monks, in effect, made it something honorable. At a time when agriculture was collapsing, the monks' labor helped to bring it back. The monks were involved in rearing cattle and horses, brewing beer, raising bees and fruit. And all over Europe, they introduced essential aspects of local economies. For example, in Sweden, it was the corn trade that owed its existence to the monks. In Parma, cheese making. In Ireland, salmon fisheries. And in a great many places, the finest vineyards. The monks were also intensely practical in that they stored up the waters from springs in order so that they could distribute them if a drought ever struck. In Lombardy, the peasants learned irrigation from the monks. The monks have also been credited with being the first to work toward improving breeds of cattle instead of just leaving the process to chance. So there's agricultural labor from the monks at a critical time in European history. With the Roman Empire collapsed, the monks show up and do all this critical work. Beyond that, the monks pioneered in machinery and mechanization. The ancient world of Greece and Rome was not particularly heavily mechanized, but Europe of the Middle Ages changed all that. Particularly the Cistercians, which are a reform-minded group of monks from the late 11th century, they built water-powered factories at hundreds of their 742 monasteries around by the 12th century. They used water power for all kinds of purposes, for crushing wheat and fulling cloth and tanning. Far more mechanized were they than anything that had ever been seen in Europe up to that time. They were also great metallurgists. They used the slag from their furnaces as fertilizer. So they were constantly thinking of practical things they could do for the life of Europe. And they instructed Europeans as to how they themselves could do these things. They were also technologically advanced in practical things like clocks. The first clock we have any record of was built by the future Pope Sylvester II in 996, but much more sophisticated clocks were built in the 14th century. But it's not just clocks, and it's not just agriculture. It's charity and education and inventiveness. All these things we're going to look at as soon as we come back from the break. So join me after the break, and let's talk more about these monks.
Господи,
Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods, and we're talking about the monks today and their unsung heroism in helping to build and even save Western civilization at critical moments. Let me give you a little quotation from a French scholar writing about the achievements of the monks, because this sums it up in terms of their practical contributions. He writes, in effect, whether it be the mining of salt, lead, iron, alum, or gypsum, or metallurgy, or quarrying marble, running cutler's shops and glassworks, or forging metal plates, also known as firebacks, there was no activity at all in which the monks did not display creativity and a fertile spirit of research. Utilizing their labor force, they instructed and trained it to perfection. Monastic know-how would spread throughout Europe. In fact, even today, we're still only beginning to appreciate fully the extent of monastic technological cleverness. In the late 1990s, an archaeometallurgist at the University of Bradford named Jerry MacDonald found evidence in North Yorkshire, England, of a degree of technological sophistication that pointed ahead to the great machines of the 18th century Industrial Revolution. He found that the monks had built a furnace to extract iron from ore. Now, in the 16th century, which is when the period that MacDonald is looking at, 16th century England, the typical one of these furnaces in the 16th century had not advanced very far over its ancient counterpart. It was very inefficient. The slag, or it's another word for the byproduct of these primitive furnaces, had a very substantial concentration of iron in it, because they couldn't get to high enough temperatures to get all the iron out of the ore. So the leftover still had a lot of iron in it. But MacDonald found that when he was investigating, that in fact the monks in England had in fact built a furnace where the slag was low in iron content. They were somehow able to get to high enough temperatures to get more and more of the iron out of it, very similar to a modern blast furnace today. So MacDonald says the monks were on the verge of building dedicated furnaces for the large-scale production of cast iron. This is the key ingredient, perhaps, that ushered in the industrial age. And he says that the furnace that he investigated in England was a prototype of such a furnace. Now, what ended up happening to that? Why didn't they develop all these big furnaces? Why do we just see this one prototype? Well, remember, this is the 16th century in England. What's King Henry VIII up to? Well, he's closing down monasteries and confiscating their property so as to reward his well-connected friends. And so Henry VIII helped to destroy this outstanding example of creativity on the part of the monks. Thank you very much, Henry VIII. We'll have time to talk about you in a future episode. But we also now have charitable work. Now, charitable work we're going to spend a whole episode on, but I want to at least pause and say something about the monks' specific contributions to charity. The rule of St. Benedict called for the monastery to dispense alms and hospitality to whatever extent its means permitted. Specifically, it instructed monasteries that all guests who come shall be received as though they were Christ. Now, the monasteries served as free inns where foreign travelers and pilgrims and the poor could find a safe resting place. I love this quotation from an old historian of the Norman Abbey of Bec. He said, "Let them ask Spaniards or Burgundians or any foreigners whatever how they have been received at Bec. They will answer that the door of the monastery is always open to all and that its bread is free to the whole world." In some cases, the monks were even known to make efforts to track down poor souls who, being lost or alone after dark, found themselves in need of emergency shelter. They established contrivances for warning sailors of perilous obstacles. Or, in fact, nearby monasteries often made provision for shipwrecked men in need of lodging. All these were typical contributions of the monks. They also built up the medieval infrastructure and built and repaired roads and bridges. But as part of their charitable work, they were also great physicians for their day. In fact, it was the church that helped to create the hospital in the first place. But the monks went even further, because there weren't hospitals everywhere. But there were a lot of monasteries. And initially, the monks provided medical care to their fellow monks. But as time went on, they realized that they possessed a critical skill that local townspeople also needed. So oftentimes they would go out into the local towns and seek out sick people who were in need of their medical care. Again, I would say that's a fairly unsung aspect of the monastic contribution. But in addition to being great physicians and agriculturists and inventors, they were also great educators. St. John Chrysostom tells us that it was already in his day, around the 4th century, it was already customary for people in Antioch to send their sons to be educated by the monks. St. Boniface established a school in every monastery he founded in Germany. In England, St. Augustine, and here we're talking not about St. Augustine of Hippo, but St. Augustine of Canterbury, St. Augustine and his monks set up schools wherever they went. St. Patrick is given credit for encouraging Irish scholarship. And of course, the Irish monasteries developed into very important centers of learning, and they dispensed instruction to monks and laymen alike. Now, sometimes it's been said that the monks did engage in some education, but they were really only educating their fellow monks. Well, that's, as we've seen, not entirely true. There are plenty of cases we have on record of the monks providing education to people in the local area. But let us say that that accusation is true. Let's even grant it for the sake of argument. Let's say that the monastery's contribution had simply been to teach other monks how to read and write. That's all it was. Well, even if that had been their only contribution, that would have been no small accomplishment. Because consider what happened in the Greek Dark Ages. Now, people have typically forgotten about this, but it's very important. From about 1100 to 800 BC, we had something called the Greek Dark Ages. And what happened here was that the Mycenaean Greeks had some kind of terrible disaster befall them. The nature of that disaster is still debated. But something terrible happened to these people. And when the smoke had cleared, for the next 300 years, we find that, in effect, the ancient Greeks, the Mycenaean Greeks, had lost literacy. They had lost the ability to read and write. Now you wonder, how could you lose the ability to read and write? How could you forget that? Well, partly it happened because people were scattered following whatever disaster it was that befell them. And they had to think solely of their own survival. And learning how to read and write was not exactly critical when you just needed food and sustenance. Secondly, it's been speculated that maybe whatever disaster struck the Mycenaean Greeks struck in particular the educated classes, so that those who would have remembered literacy were in fact wiped out. Well, whatever the explanation, the fact is they lost literacy at a time of general civilizational collapse. Well, let's remember that the monks were functioning and carrying out all these wonderful tasks I've described at a time in Western European history that was very similar. There was general collapse. There was political disorder. There was an abandonment of education by and large. There was an abandonment of urban life. That was the environment in which the monks functioned. And so even if all they had done was to keep literacy alive, well, that's very important, because that means they prevented a repeat of the Greek Dark Ages when literacy was lost. Thanks to the monasteries, literacy was not lost, but Western Europe managed to hang on to it. That's no small contribution, is it? In fact, the contributions of the monks have been so great that even scholars who are inclined to be unsympathetic to them have conceded it. And I've always tried to go out of my way when I've written about Catholic history to cite not only non-Catholics, but anti-Catholics when possible, so that people won't come back and say that I'm just picking and choosing among my sources. When people who don't even like the Catholic Church are saying, okay, the monks did a lot, that says something. So, for example, one unsympathetic scholar said, the monks not only established the schools and were the schoolmasters in them, but also laid the foundations for the universities. They were the thinkers and philosophers of the day and shaped the political and religious thought. To them, both collectively and individually, was due the continuity of thought and civilization of the ancient world with the later Middle Ages and with the modern period. That's no small compliment. A century ago, another historian said, "It was the monks, and they alone, who carried to a successful issue the tremendous undertaking of mollifying the rampant invader, softening the rudeness of his manners and the harshness of his spirit, familiarizing him with the restraints of Christian morality, and bringing home to him with convincing power the necessity of observing the fundamental principles of law and order, instructing him in the use of arts and instruments of industry and social progress, in a word, of assimilating, civilizing, and Christianizing 20-odd barbarian tribes, many of which, by the way, were very impressed with the morality and the conviction of the monks. They were very moved by their witness." A Protestant historian says, "Had it not been for the monks and monasteries, the barbarian deluge might have swept away utterly the traces of Roman civilization. The monk was the pioneer of civilization and Christianity in England, Germany, Poland, Bohemia, Sweden, Denmark. With the incessant din of arms around him, it was the monk in his cloister, for instance on Mount Athos, who by preserving and transcribing ancient manuscripts, both Christian and pagan, as well as by recording his observations of contemporaneous events, was handing down the torch of knowledge unquenched to future generations, and hoarding up stores of erudition for the researches of a more enlightened age. The first musicians, painters, farmers, statesmen in Europe, after the downfall of imperial Rome, under the onslaught of the barbarians, were monks." Now these are critics of the monks. You can only imagine what their friends have to say. These are their critics. Here is the monastic contribution. And you'll notice that in this brief overview, I've not even mentioned, or at least hardly so, the contributions they made to the literature of the Western world by preserving ancient classics and indeed the Bible itself through laborious copying. Because that is the one thing that's conceded to us. The monks did this. But what I want to show you is they did so much else in so many areas, one can hardly even believe it. Now today we touched briefly on the subject of charity, because we saw the monks as great dispensers of charity. Guests are to be treated as if they were Christ himself. Well, that is a small part of the story of Catholic charity, which will occupy us next time. Catholic charity is one of these areas in which people will concede the Catholic Church has done wonderful things. But what I want to suggest to you is that even we Catholics don't realize just how great Catholic charity is. It's a far more extraordinary story than even we believe. So join me next time on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. See you then. Even her detractors admit that the charitable work of the Catholic Church has been extraordinary. But today we're going to see that Catholic charity has historically been even greater than Catholics themselves may realize. So join me today for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Today we're talking about Catholic charity. Now we all think we know all about Catholic charity, and indeed we do know a great deal about it. Even her opponents admit that the Catholic Church has done more charitable work than you can possibly believe. But Catholic charity is in fact even greater than people realize. And today we're going to explore why. For instance, it's the quality of the charity as well as the quantity. It's not simply that the Catholic Church did a lot of good work for people. That we'll look at in a moment. But it's the spirit that animated that charity as well. So, for instance, the Catholic Church taught that you should help somebody not because you expect a reward, or you're going to keep hectoring this person forever that you owe me something, remember I helped you 3.5 years ago, or you don't do it so that you can show the world what a great person you are. You do it because it pleases God, because you respect a fellow human being as being made in the image and likeness of God, and that you know that charitable work pleases Him. This is why you do it. You do it out of a love for God and your fellow man, not because you expect any kind of reciprocity. Beyond that, we have even the counsel from the church that you should even help your own enemies. What, are you crazy? In the ancient world, they would have thought that was crazy. In ancient Greece and Rome, that would have been considered absurd. And indeed, in the ancient world, a lot of the giving was self-interested. It was not given out of the pure desire simply to help a fellow human being. So the quality, the kind of charitable work, the spirit that animated it, was very different in the Catholic world than it had been in the world that preceded the Church. But we should not at the same time disparage the question of quantity, because here too the Church excelled. Because for the first time you had institutionalized care for the sick and widows and orphans and the poor. Now again, there had been generosity shown in the ancient world, no one would deny that, but nowhere near the level that we see under the Catholic Church. Now remember my rule, I want to cite anti-Catholics whenever I can to show that what I'm saying really is true, because even an opponent of the Church admits it. Well, I'm fond of citing a historian from the 19th century named W.E.H. Lecky, because he was known to be an opponent of the Catholic Church, and yet, when he wrote about this subject, and he spanned the historical record, he concluded that there is no question that neither in practice nor in theory, neither in the institutions that were founded, nor in the place that was assigned to it in the scale of duties, did charity in antiquity occupy a position at all comparable to that which it has obtained by Christianity. So it's both the quality and the quantity of the Catholic charitable work that distinguishes it and makes it so historically interesting and compelling. Now, one objection can be raised to what I've said so far. There was an ancient school of philosophical thought called Stoicism. And the Stoics did indeed seem to be people who called for doing good deeds out of a sense of duty and without any expectation of reciprocity. The Stoics, in effect, believed that the wise man was a man who had no emotional connection to the world, who was such a master of his own person that he was utterly unperturbed by outside events, no matter how tragic. Well, it was in that spirit, that very, in a sense, empty kind of spirit of merely discharging your duty, that the Stoics engaged in charitable work. Yes, they taught that the wise man knows that he is a citizen of the world and all men are, in effect, to be cared for, but they are to be cared for without lending any emotional attachment to the relationship. So, for example, Seneca, who was a Stoic, said, "The sage will console those who weep, but without weeping with them. He will succor the shipwrecked, give hospitality to the proscribed, and alms to the poor, restore the son to the mother's tears, save the captive from the arena, and even bury the criminal. But in all, his mind and his countenance will be alike untroubled. He will feel no pity. He will do good, for he is born to assist his fellows, to labor for the welfare of mankind, and to offer each one his part. His countenance and his soul will betray no emotion as he looks upon the withered legs, the tattered rags, the bent and emaciated frame of the beggar. But he will help those who are worthy, and like the gods, his leaning will be toward the wretched. But it is only diseased eyes that grow moist in beholding tears in other eyes." Well, that was the spirit of the charity of the Stoics. So they themselves were to be unperturbed by outside events, by the misfortunes of those whom they helped. And so naturally they were perhaps not as eager to go out looking for evil because they, in effect, tried to ignore the existence of evil. They did not make the kind of emotional connection that we see, for example, in a Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa, these people were not. In fact, we have example after example of Stoics being given bad news. For instance, "Sir, your child has just perished." And we hear the Stoic reply so flippantly, saying things like, "Well, had to go sometime." Who on earth would say that when losing a child? But that was how the Stoic demonstrated his complete mastery of the outside world. "I'm unperturbed by this. Nothing can affect me. I do not let my emotions get the better of me." Now, getting back to the Catholic Church, where does this spirit of Catholic charity come from? Well, it comes from her founder. It comes from the teaching of Christ himself, who of course said to us, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another." St. Paul went to an even greater extreme to some people when he specifically noted that you should show charity even toward your enemies. Now, Christ instructed that of us as well. But St. Paul was cited repeatedly on this front, and his letters were cited repeatedly by early church fathers to encourage people to follow the counsel of St. Paul, and in fact to do good even for their enemies. Now, we're going to talk more about Catholics doing good for their enemies a little bit later. But for right now, let's look at early church history and see them taking the words of Christ and making them into reality. We already see that in early church history, during the context of the Mass, the faithful's offerings for the poor would be placed on the altar. Early Christians also imposed fasts on themselves so that they could save the money they would otherwise use to buy food and give that to those who were in need. Now, the church fathers even, who, as I said in a previous episode, were prolific writers, and that St. Isidore of Seville once said that if you tell me that you've read everything St. Augustine wrote, you're obviously a liar. Yet they found time to do this because this is an indispensable part of the Christian life. St. Augustine, for instance, established a hospice for pilgrims, ransomed slaves, and gave away clothing to the poor. In fact, he told people, "Don't give me expensive clothing as a gift. You may like me, you may be impressed with my writing and my speaking, but don't give me expensive clothes because I'm not going to wear them. I'm just going to sell them and give the proceeds to the poor." St. Cyprian and St. Ephrem organized relief efforts during times of plague and famine. Now, St. Cyprian in particular instructed Christians, this is the 3rd century, during a pestilence in Carthage. He said, "If we only do good to those who do good to us, what do we more than the heathens and publicans? If we are the children of God, who makes his sun to shine upon good and bad, and sends rain on the just and the unjust, let us prove it by our acts, by blessing those who curse us, and doing good to those who persecute us." Now, there was a fellow named Pachomius in the Roman army in the early 4th century who was very impressed that at a time when famine and disease struck the army, who came out and helped them? Who came out and lent their undiscriminating assistance? It was those who believed in Christ. And here they were helping some of the very people who had persecuted them in the past. This amazed Pachomius. He wondered what kind of religious tradition could it be that could inspire this kind of disinterested benevolence, in which you would indiscriminately do good, even to those who had done evil to you. He couldn't believe these people. So what do you think happened? He began investigating the faith. What is this all about? And before long, he himself was a convert. This is, in large part, how a great many Catholics have converted non-Catholics. It's not always by debating them into the church or bashing them over the head into the church, although, by the way, that's how I came in. people bashed me over the head over and over and said, "It's the one true church. What's the matter with you, you Lutheran?" And it made me think, and I came in. But other people have been brought into the church because Catholics have just niced them to death. They're just so nice to them all the time, they just can't take it anymore. "Okay, I will look into this. How can you people be so good to me?" And that's what brings them in. That's what brought in Pachomius. This is the great witness of Catholic charity. Now, as I say, it's always fun to see what anti-Catholics have to say. And there are many of them. But even anti-Catholics have admitted, as we'll see after the break, famous anti-Catholics have admitted that they don't know how to account for what the Catholic Church has done. They look at Mother Teresa, they don't know how to explain this without using a supernatural explanation. Well, let's go ahead and come on back after the break, and we're going to see some of the Church's most outspoken opponents and what they've had to say about Catholic charity. So come right back. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Today we're talking about the extraordinary story of Catholic charity and arguing that in fact it's been far greater than even the Church's greatest friends, I think, have sometimes appreciated. So we've gone through and seen, for example, what the early Church Fathers did in terms of charity. I gave a few examples of that. Or we've seen in the Scriptures where Catholics are urged to display an exemplary degree of charity. We've seen how it contrasts with the attitude of the ancient world, in which charitable work was something to be done, in effect, for a reward, or to call attention to oneself. And even when you do have the example of a school of thought like the Stoics, that does seem to say you should do good without expecting a reward, they do it out of such an emotionless sense of duty that we almost would view it as dehumanizing today. And that's not what the Catholic Church calls for at all. Well, just before the break, I was pointing out that a great many of the Church's best-known opponents over the years have conceded this point about Catholic charity. So I'd like to make good on that promise and go through a few of them, because this is quite astonishing, what we hear. Voltaire was perhaps the most anti-Catholic French intellectual of the 18th century, and that is saying something. And yet even Voltaire had to admit that he could not get over the extraordinary sacrifice that women religious made in order to work in hospitals. These nuns and their good work were extraordinary to him. And so Voltaire actually said, "Perhaps there is nothing greater on earth than the sacrifice of youth and beauty, often of high birth, made by the gentle sex in order to work in hospitals for the relief of human misery, the sight of which is so revolting to our delicacy." And he said, "Peoples separated from the Roman religion have imitated only imperfectly so generous a charity." Well, of course, ours is the Roman religion that he names. Now that is quite extraordinary, isn't it? That even Voltaire, who despised Catholicism, had to say, I have to hand it to them, I don't know how to account for this. Another example I sometimes cite is Julian the Apostate. Julian the Apostate was a 4th century Roman emperor from about the 360s, and Julian was anti-Christian through and through. He despised the toleration that had been extended to Christianity in the Edict of Milan in 313 by the Emperor Constantine. And in fact, Julian wanted to bring back ancient paganism and wipe out the Christian presence. And so, what did he try to do? He tried to revive a pagan priesthood and pagan ceremonies and all the trappings of an ancient pagan religion and give that the support of the state. And one thing Julian kept coming back to was that people kept being attracted to the Christian religion because the priests in that religion were so good and kind and generous, and the faithful in that religion were so good and kind and generous. And it drives Julian crazy. He says repeatedly, these people are so nice, why are my pagan priests not that nice? Why are you pagans not so nice? Because the Christians are coming in and they're snatching up people left and right by their good example. Why can't we come anywhere near imitating them? Well, there's an interesting compliment, isn't it? Okay, I mean, Julian has no particular interest in complimenting people who have the faith, and yet here he is forced to do it because you're showing us up as pagans. Now, my personal favorite in this list is Martin Luther, because I myself am a former Lutheran. That is a whole other story for a whole other program. However, I know a little something about Luther. I've read an awful lot of what Luther wrote. And Luther himself admitted that he couldn't quite get a handle on Catholic charity either. And why it was that charitable work under his teaching seemed to dry up. He had no explanation for this, and it drove him crazy. Now, before I go any further, I want to anticipate an objection here, because sometimes I get this. I get people saying, well, should you really portray Martin Luther as an enemy of the Catholic faith? I mean, wasn't he, toward the end of his life, didn't I hear something about maybe he was having second thoughts? Well, I don't think so. Because, in fact, the last book Martin Luther wrote was called Against the Papacy at Rome, an Institution of the Devil. So if he's having second thoughts, he has a very funny way of showing it. Well, Luther, of course, taught the doctrine of justification by faith alone. And he repeatedly said that we don't need to do good works in order to get into heaven. Now, this is a very technical theological discussion here. And Luther, by the way, was not saying that nobody should do good works. In fact, Luther argued that a Lutheran could do good works in an even purer spirit than a Catholic could, because a Lutheran would know that the good works were not going to do anything for him salvation-wise. He was doing them only because he loved God, whereas a Catholic is always thinking in terms of self-interest when he does good works. But Luther's point was that good works aren't going to do anything in terms of your salvation, whether they're done in the state of grace or whatever, not going to do anything. But what some people took Luther to mean, and Luther is partly to blame for this, was that you don't need to do good works, period. Because Luther would speak in such exaggerated language that at one point he actually said, you can commit adultery 100 times a day, and you can commit 100 murders a day, but as long as you have adultery 100 times a day, and you can commit 100 murders a day, but as long as you have a lively faith, this will not tear you away from Christ. Well, I think people can be forgiven if they conclude from that good works are not that important. So what Luther started to see in his day was this phenomenon, whereby a tradition of good works began to dry up completely. In fact, Luther himself deeply regretted this and said, at least under the papacy, that is to say, at least under the Catholic Church, you didn't have to force people to be charitable. You didn't have to hold a gun to their heads. They would be charitable spontaneously. He says, whereas living under the gospel, and by under the gospel he means under Lutheranism, he says, not only do I see no charity, to the contrary, people are grasping at each other's belongings. People have become envious and self-centered. He was very interested in this. And throughout his life, he continued to observe good works by Catholics in hospitals and so forth. And it really was a rebuke to him. In fact, at one point, he got so frustrated with his fellow Germans that he tried to leave altogether. He just said, I just had it with you people. Nobody's living the gospel. Nobody's living the Christian life. That's interesting. He had to concede. The Catholic Church had helped to make people charitable. Now, a couple years ago, I was interviewed in the Washington Post. So obviously somebody was fired over that, but I was interviewed in the Washington Post in their live online segment, which I really like, because it's a live question and answer session on the internet. And so readers can type in questions, and then I'm sitting at my computer and I'm seeing all the questions come in, and then I answer them. Well, the questions are coming in fast and furious, so if you didn't have carpal tunnel syndrome before this process, you definitely have it afterward. One of the questions I got I thought was very interesting, and I thought a fair question. The person asked, after all, however, isn't Catholic charity really at its root self-interested? Because, in fact, isn't the person engaged in charity because he expects a reward? He expects to go to heaven. So can't we really say that really Catholic people are no different from people in the ancient world? They're all seeking rewards. And so I thought that was a fair enough objection. So I explained, I gave this answer. And I hope this is a good enough answer. If you don't think it's a good enough answer, write to me and I'll give a better answer the next time. But I gave an answer that was twofold. I said, first of all, the Catholic Church recommends to us in effect tells us there are three different levels of sanctity when it comes to doing good. Some people do good simply because they're afraid of going to hell, and that's the only motivation that will reach those people. Now, that's considered to be sort of good enough, but it's certainly not the ideal. At the next level, people do good because, as the questioner suggests, they seek heaven. And now, I personally see nothing wrong with that. But even that is not the ultimate level that the Church recommends to us. The Church says there is a top level. There's a level at which people do good solely because they love God and they want to please God. And that's why they're doing their good works. Not for any expectation or hope of reward, but because they want to please the God they love. And I said to the questioner, this is what the Church is calling us to, is precisely this level of benevolence at which we're not thinking about ourselves. We're thinking only about God and only about doing good for its own sake. But then secondly, I said, consider Mother Teresa's missionaries of charity, because they're such an excellent example. I said, consider them. Now you may say, they're doing all these good works and helping all these people who are in wretched conditions oftentimes, and the sickest of the sick and the poorest of the poor, and they're helping those people simply because they want to go to heaven. But they could go to heaven by working in an air-conditioned office. So what makes them want to work in Calcutta, places of that sort, or makes them want to work in AIDS hospices? I said, they can get to heaven doing those more comfortable things. They can be in an air-conditioned office. Why do they seek this out, then? If all they care about is going to heaven, they could do something else. And moreover, look into their eyes. Look into the eyes of one of those missionaries of charity nuns in one of these AIDS hospices, in which she's looking at patients who oftentimes during their lives have been alienated from the church and sometimes even hostile. And when they look up from their beds at these women religious, all they see are eyes filled with love. And I said, can you really look in those eyes and say that all you see is a woman seeking a reward? That's all you see? Don't you see something there that is far deeper and more significant and more moving? That was my answer. And I think that is ultimately the answer. And in fact, the Christian God, following from the Hebrew tradition, believes that it is good for human beings to be good to each other. And this was something new among the religions of the ancient Near East. The gods of ancient Sumer didn't seem to care about the human race at all, or what they did. The gods of ancient Greece sometimes used human beings as playthings. They treated them arbitrarily. They were capricious toward human beings. They didn't seem to care how people behaved toward each other. If you wanted to satisfy some of those gods that I've mentioned, you could do so only through various kinds of ritual sacrifice and then just hope for the best. But our God is pleased not only by the sacrifice of the Mass, but is also pleased by good behavior. He cares about how we treat each other. This was something new under the sun. He doesn't want only ceremony, as important as that is, but he cares that we should be good. We should be good to each other, and that's one of the things that pleases him. And it should not come as a surprise that a God who teaches this is going to give a brand new morality to his people. So next time we're going to see how Western standards of morality have been shaped by the Church. So join me for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization, and I'll see you then. We've been talking about a lot of things the Catholic Church has introduced into the world. But how about the sanctity of life, the dignity of marriage? Let's talk about these things and a whole lot more today on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Last time we talked about Catholic charity and how important and impressive it is. Today we're going to talk about moral principles more generally. And we're going to find there's much in common in the two episodes. Because it's not as if we have some views on charity and then some views on morality and some views on this and some views on that. It all comes down to the same message. The idea that human life is sacred, and that each individual has a uniqueness and worth because he possesses an immortal soul, he possesses a rational nature, because he is made in the image and likeness of God. Now this is a revolutionary message. At the end of our segment last time, I pointed out that a lot of the religions in the Near East took the view that human behavior really wasn't all that important to the gods. I pointed out, for example, that the Sumerians were just at their wits' end as to what to do to appease their gods. Nothing seemed to appease them. And it so happened, of course, that they happened to live in a place that was particularly geographically vulnerable to floods that did not occur on any regular basis. So they tended to view the universe as a hostile place, governed by hostile gods who frankly were uninterested in their welfare. I gave the example of the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks had gods who treated them arbitrarily and capriciously, weren't particularly keen on teaching them morality and good behavior. This seemed quite beside the point. The ancient Greek gods were often completely self-absorbed and narcissistic, nothing at all like the God of our own tradition. Well, it's no surprise, therefore, that in the Christian tradition, we believe that there are certain ways we should behave and that God wants us to do these things, that God cares about us. God actually cares how we treat each other. In these other religions, we see an emphasis on appeasing God through engaging in various kinds of ritual sacrifice. Now, it's true that for Catholics, we engage in the holy sacrifice of the Mass every day. But we also treat each other, are supposed to treat each other well, because that pleases God too. And that's something unique in the history of religions up to that point. This was something new in the world. And so the same religion that teaches you to give of yourself to others, to think about other people and their misfortunes, and to give in a way that's unselfish and in no way self-interested, that same religion, it should not surprise us, also teaches us important moral principles that follow from the idea of the sanctity of life. It's a single stream of thought. Now, how can we see these principles in practice? Look at the early church. What types of things do we see going on in the early church? What are the causes that people are taking up in their society? Well, of course, the early church gets its start during the period of the Roman Empire. And what do we see going on there? Well, among other things, we see the practice of infanticide taking place, literal infanticide. It isn't simply that the church went after abortion, which of course it did, but we see even a much worse situation. We have actual infants simply being left to die, and typically because they were the wrong sex. So you had many healthy female children simply exposed and abandoned. And we see the effects of this, by the way, because in the Roman Empire, men outnumbered women by 30%. There's that doctrine in play. But the Catholic Church moved to abolish that practice. But what we also note is that in the ancient world, there is no comparable teaching to what we see in the Catholic Church about the uniqueness of human life and its absolute sanctity. Now, it's true that the ancients did say that man had a dignity that surpassed that of other creatures, but they came nowhere near the Catholic belief in the sanctity of human life. We do not see that in the ancient world, even though we admire and respect the ancient world. Many of the early Christians looked with profound respect at the ancient world. They pointed to people like Plato and Aristotle as having anticipated some of the most sublime teachings of Christ himself, but at the same time they understood that there was much that was in fact to be deplored in the ancient world. For example, Plato, one of the most noble philosophers you can imagine in the ancient world, deeply admired by St. Augustine and others. On one occasion, Plato said that a man who is too sick to work should be left to die. It's impossible to imagine that in the Catholic Church. Now, what else is going on in ancient Rome, particularly? We see gladiatorial contests. That is to say, people are going and watching their fellow human beings try to kill each other, and this is a form of entertainment. Well, obviously, this is an unspeakable offense against the dignity of human life. And it trivializes human life, that someone's death would be something that we would want to be entertained by. So, in fact, it was the Christian emperors who helped to abolish these gladiatorial contests, and that has been called one of the greatest moral victories in history. But it's not just that. It isn't just that we see examples of barbarism in the ancient world. Barbarism, by the way, that we're seeing, of course, coming up once again in our own time. We're also finding that there's a difference between the way the ancient Romans and Greeks treated the interaction of men and women and the ideal that we have for that. The ancient Greeks were utterly contemptuous of women, whereas in the Catholic faith, we see, in fact, a profound respect for women. And I realize this is the opposite of what people say. Supposedly, the Catholic Church is anti-woman, and it's pro-man, and it's patriarchal, and all the rest of it. But for heaven's sake, let's think about it. Where else in the ancient world, or even going up into the Middle Ages, where in the world could you see women who were able to run their own institutions? They ran their own convents and schools and orphanages and so on and on. Where do you see that other than in the Catholic Church? We have a legion of female saints. We have tremendous devotion to the Blessed Mother. We have all these aspects of the faith that are pro-woman, and there are still others as well. And this is why in the early church it so happens that the Catholic religion was accused of being a woman's religion because so many women belonged to it. So much for the idea that the church is an opponent of women. It was called a women's religion. Now we see also an emphasis in the church on the dignity of marriage, that intimate relations between men and women were to be confined to the marital bond, such that even Edward Gibbon, some of you may know Edward Gibbon, was the historian in the 18th century who blamed the fall of Rome on the Christian religion. So he was not inclined to be sympathetic, but even he had to admit that in fact the Christians have helped to restore dignity to the marital bond. Likewise, the church taught what we might call the equalization of adultery. That is to say, it's not simply something to be deplored when a wife cheats on her husband, but it is equally to be deplored when a husband cheats on his wife. And Edward Westermarck, who was an expert in the history of Western marriage, has said that in fact it was the Christian religion that finally equalized adultery. So we have an emphasis on the equality when it comes to adultery, an emphasis on the sanctity of the marital bond. We have women in, to use a modern phrase, leadership roles. And in fact, incidentally, by equalizing adultery, in effect, the church is saying that men can't just get up and leave their wives, and leave them with nothing. So these things, in fact, attracted women. But it's more than even this. What else do we see with the Catholic Church's emphasis on the dignity of human life? Well, we see a campaign against even the practice of suicide, dignity of human life. Well, we see a campaign against even the practice of suicide. Now this may seem strange. Isn't everyone opposed to suicide? Not so, actually. Ancient Greeks like Aristotle were against suicide. But others in the ancient world, in fact, believe it or not, had supported suicide. You'll recall from an earlier episode we talked about the Stoics. The Stoics were a school of thought that argued that the ideal human being should be so much the master of himself that he should be utterly unperturbed by outside events. He should be have complete mastery over himself and his emotions. He should never allow his emotions to get the better of him. Well, the Stoics argued that in fact suicide was in some ways even an admirable way to depart this world, because there, more than in any other case, the ideal man was showing that he was utterly unperturbed by the world, so much so that he, at the moment of his choosing, would decide when he would depart that world. How else can you see an even better example of the idea of the Stoic values in practice? I am so above other events in the world that I can even depart this world when I choose. That is my mastery over the world. That type of narcissism, in fact, informed the Stoics' views on suicide. And of course the Church had to say, this is not only nonsense, but dangerous nonsense. That life is something valuable, and we aren't simply to cast it aside on a whim when we think it's a good idea. In fact, a number of Catholics pointed out that Christ obviously disapproved of suicide. At no point did he say to his followers, listen, if the persecution ever gets too bad, you can just commit suicide. We can't even imagine those words being uttered. But there is the Catholic Church's emphasis on the sanctity of life. It is not to be disposed of even by ourselves, much less by some distant government or by some gladiator in a contest in the arena. Now, even beyond this, we have yet another topic that touches on the sanctity of life, and that's the subject of the waging of war. Because it was the Church who, before any other institution, introduced the idea that there actually could be limits on what is permitted in war, on the reasons you can go to war, and the spirit in which war can be waged. There was nothing that corresponded to that in the ancient world because they did not have the same spirit of respect for the sanctity and dignity of life. So this moral issue pressed specifically on Catholics. When we come back from the break, we'll talk more about the just war tradition. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods, and we're talking today about Catholic moral principles that most people, non-Catholics included, have come to take for granted. In fact, so much so, they hardly even look for their source. But their source, as in the case of so many wonderful fruits of our Western civilization, is in fact the Catholic Church. And so we've looked at infanticide and gladiatorial contests, and suicide, and now we're beginning to look at the subject of war. The just war tradition develops in the Catholic world, perhaps beginning with Ambrose, but definitely beginning with St. Augustine. St. Augustine had a great deal to say about the justice of war. What's interesting to note, as I said before the break, is that there really wasn't anything like a just war tradition prior to Catholic reflection on the subject. And this is very much different from the views that we see in the 16th century with a famous political philosopher named Machiavelli. Machiavelli was in effect of the opinion that governments could not be held up to moral standards the way individuals were. Governments in effect had to do what they had to do. But the Church condemned that view and was condemning it as early as St. Augustine. So, for example, some of the principles that were laid out by Catholic thinkers, according to which war could be justly waged, were as follows. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas, in his famous segment on war, said that it's important that the war be declared by the pertinent authority. An individual on his own cannot simply go and declare war. It has to be somebody who holds legitimate, duly constituted authority. Secondly, there has to be a just cause involved. Any old reason for waging war is not acceptable. And there has to be a right intention. You can't go to war solely out of desire for vengeance or just for a desire for conquest. So in other words, war cannot always be justified. Just because a war is going on does not make it just. So St. Thomas set down these important principles. And then with the passage of time, we begin to get the development of the just war tradition in the Catholic Church even further. In the 16th century, for example, a great man at the University of Salamanca named Francisco de Vitoria had much to say on the subject of the just war. And a couple of Catholic historians have recently summed up his view, I think very nicely and eloquently. Vitoria, in effect, said as follows, that assuming that a prince has authority to make war, he should first of all not go seeking occasions and causes of war, but should, if possible, live in peace with all men, as St. Paul enjoins on us. When war for a just cause has broken out, it must not be waged so as to ruin the people to whom it is directed, but only so as to obtain one's rights and the defense of one's country, and in order that from that war peace and security may in time result. When victory has been won, victory should be utilized with moderation and Christian humility. Francisco Suarez likewise said, a just war must be waged by a legitimate power. Second, its cause must be just and right. Third, just methods should be used, that is, equity in the beginning of the war and the prosecution of it, and in victory. The reason of the general conclusion is that although war in itself is not an evil, yet on account of the many ills which it brings in its train, it is to be numbered among those undertakings which are often wrongly done, and thus it needs many circumstances to make it honest. Now, that is at least a brief taste of the just war tradition, and there are, of course, modern just war theologians who are trying to adapt this tradition to modern circumstances and continue to develop it. But the critical idea here is that states are subject to moral rules and cannot simply do whatever they wish. They are not allowed, for example, simply, for no other reason, simply to go out and slaughter civilians. There are rules on how war should be conducted, and that is because of the Church's emphasis on the sanctity and dignity of life. Now, I recall years ago, back before my Catholic days, I was a student at Harvard, and that is a whole other show in itself, what it was like keeping your sanity being at Harvard. But I remember one of my dear friends at Harvard. His name was Fred DeCaro, lives in Connecticut. He's actually designed my website for me for free, so I figured he gives me a free website, I mention him on television. Well, Fred DeCaro once said to me when I was still a Protestant, he said, he asked me why I wasn't a Catholic, and I gave some hemming and hawing answer. I didn't have any good answer. I don't know. I haven't thought about it. I haven't spent the time to think about it. But I asked him why he was one. Why are you a Catholic? And there are a lot of different reasons people could give for this, right? I mean, well, I was swept up by the Bible. I was swept up by the story of some saint. A lot of people prayed me into the church, or some argument convinced me, or whatever. But his answer was very simple, and I never forgot it. And it stayed with me all the way to my conversion. He said, because the Catholic Church tells us how to lead the good life. That's simple. The Catholic Church tells us how to lead the good life. Couldn't ever get that out of my head, because I thought to myself that what the Church teaches in so many areas is in fact challenging to us. And in some ways it's a real challenge to the baser part of our nature to live up to the great ideal that the Church holds out to us. But I remember coming to the conclusion one day that everybody at some point in his life has to answer the question, do I intend to live as a human being, or do I intend to live as a beast? And the Catholic Church holds out a glorious and noble path of life in which you're not self-absorbed, in which the whole world doesn't revolve around you, but you are part of a nexus where you care about other people and you care enough about yourself to treat yourself with dignity. And I recall there's a quotation from Seneca, an ancient Roman, who said, "What a contemptible thing is man if he fails to rise above the human condition." Even a pagan Roman understood that there's something about unaided human nature that is incomplete, that cannot live the virtuous life without extra help. So it was almost as if Seneca understood that if we're going to live a life that truly befits a human being, we need the assistance of divine grace. Now, the animal kingdom is composed of creatures who possess only instinct. They can't engage in moral reflection. They don't possess reason. So it stands to reason that we human beings should be held to a higher standard than the beasts, that we should observe moral principles, we should reflect on our behavior. Now, all this went through my mind as I was considering converting to the Catholic Church, and I was attracted to her moral teaching. A lot of people say, "Oh, the Church is too tough in her moral teaching. She'll drive people away." To the contrary. People ultimately, deep down, want to be challenged. They want to be challenged by holiness. And I remember that that's what attracted me. And I remember learning that in ancient Greece, Socrates had said that to know the good is to do the good. That as soon as you know what the good thing to do is, well, you just automatically feel compelled to do it. But I knew that wasn't so. I knew of many times in my life when I had perfectly well known what the good thing was to do, and I absolutely had not done it. And I had perfectly well known what the evil thing to do was, and I had pursued that. So much for Socrates. But then you read St. Paul. And St. Paul has so much moral realism when he says that there are times when I know perfectly well what the good is, and I shun it. And I know perfectly well what the evil is, but yet I pursue that. And I remember once I finally did convert to the Church, I remember my spiritual director telling me that the next time I was tempted to eat a cupcake, I should have a carrot instead. Now, what did he mean by that? Did he mean that cupcakes were evil? He meant that cupcakes are delicious. That's why it's an exercise of will to avoid them. And that by avoiding something like a cupcake, which is morally neutral, I can train my will. I can, in effect, tell myself, I am in control. I'm not going to be swept away by passions. I'm not going to be swept away by irrationality. I can train myself because by avoiding cupcakes and eating carrots, I train my will to be able to say no. So that when the moment of temptation comes and I really am faced with a choice between good and evil, I will have a will that is trained to face it and come out victorious. Now, what a beautiful message this is, that as a human being you have such a dignity that there is a special kind of life that God wants you to live that is appropriate for you as a human being. And I was recently at DePaul University. They had an event called Catholic Week. I won't get into Catholic Week at a Catholic university. What about the other 51 weeks? That's another matter. But when I was at DePaul, a reporter for the student paper asked me, how would you sum up your talk? Give me one sentence. Well, I couldn't give her one sentence. Gave her two or three. But I said, here's what I would say to the students at DePaul. I would say that the Catholic Church is the most beautiful institution on earth. And if you want to live a good life, if you want to live a life that befits a human being, the Catholic Church has much to say to you. And that's a message I think a lot of young people who are totally adrift could stand to hear. Of course, I feel old anytime I start talking about young people, but such is life. Now, let me conclude with this. The Catholic Church consistently emphasizes the dignity and value of human life and tells us that we are to live in constant awareness of our created nature in the image and likeness of God, that we are not to live as beasts, that we're not just to do whatever brings us pleasure, then we might as well be a cow. You're not a cow, you're a human being. Christ didn't die for cows, He died for you. And He died in part so you could live a good life, so that we may be worthy to join with God in heaven. What an astonishing statement. It's particularly beautiful that the Eastern Fathers talked about deification, that in effect, as we live the life of the sacraments, we become like God. Now there is some real dignity. There is the idea that human beings aren't just random assemblages of cells, but they are worth something. They matter. And here's something you can finally tell to teenagers, that you don't have to live this crummy life that MTV is holding out for you. What in the world is there to compare between MTV and the Catholic Church? 2,000 years of heroism and holiness. And they think so little of young people, they're going to hold out the MTV alternative? Forget it. Ditch it. Don't live as beasts. Live as human beings. That's what the Church has to tell us all. Now, there's another way that the Church has emphasized the dignity and rights of the individual, and that is with the very idea of rights. And that's what we're going to pick up next time. Where does this idea that I have a right to life and a right not to be robbed or expropriated, that comes also from the Catholic Church. So join me next time for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. See you then.